He wasn't the tallest, he wasn't the fastest. But when Igor Vovchanchyn entered the ring, giants fell. A 5'8" tank with tree-trunk arms and fists like wrecking balls, Igor tore through the early days of MMA with a silent fury. He fought men 30 pounds heavier, took brutal punishment, and kept coming. No showboating, no trash talk, just destruction. Then, without warning, he was gone. No press conference, no retirement speech, no closure, just silent. This is the forgotten legacy of a Ukrainian powerhouse who rewrote what was possible in a fight, and then walked away without a word. And what we found when we looked deeper is chilling. He wasn't supposed to win. He wasn't even supposed to belong. Standing just 5 feet 8 inches, with the build of a stocky street brawler and a calm, emotionless stare, Igor Vovchanchyn didn't look like the future of MMA. But in the lawless early years of the sport, when rules were loose, weight classes didn't matter, and fights could go all night, Igor carved out a name with his fists. Born in the Soviet Union in the mid-1970s, Igor grew up surrounded by hardship. In his Ukrainian hometown, strength wasn't for sport, it was for survival. As a teen, he picked fights with older boys and grown men alike, gaining a reputation as the kind of guy you didn't look at the wrong way. What he lacked in size, he made up for in sheer brutality. Before MMA even had a name, Igor was already knocking out men twice his size in underground brawls across Eastern Europe. His background wasn't traditional. He had no black belt, no team behind him. What he had were fists like sledgehammers and a complete lack of fear. He competed in bare-knuckle tournaments, sometimes fighting 3 to 5 times in a single night. No gloves, no doctors, just pain. And yet, he kept winning. Word spread fast. There was a short Ukrainian kid out there who was knocking out giants. At a time when fighters were often chosen for their marketability, Igor earned his place purely by force. In 1995, he entered the World Veil Tudo Championship and destroyed the competition, becoming a regional legend in Russia and surrounding countries. While American fans followed UFC's early stars like Royce Gracie and Ken Shamrock, Eastern Europe had its own beast. But Igor was different. He didn't taunt. He didn't smile. After each fight, he bowed his head and quietly walked away. Reporters said he barely spoke. Fighters who faced him described an unsettling stillness in his eyes, as if violence came naturally. Even then, Igor's aura wasn't about hype. It was about fear, and that fear was well-earned. His hands were absurdly fast for a heavyweight. His looping hooks didn't just knock people out, they rearranged faces. He once broke an opponent's orbital socket with a single punch. He didn't train in luxury gyms or under the spotlight. He trained in cold gyms in Kharkiv, surrounded by rusted weights and cement walls. Igor Vovchanchyn was forged, not built. He was a product of war-torn grit, and when he stepped into the cage, he brought a level of cold, mechanical violence that few had ever seen. This wasn't a man trying to be famous. He was trying to destroy, and in doing so, he was just getting started. When Igor entered Pride FC in the late 1990s, fans in Japan didn't quite know what to make of him. He wasn't flashy like Sakuraba. He wasn't built like Mark Kerr. He didn't even have a nickname. But the moment he stepped into that ring, they understood. He was violence in human form. Pride was known for spectacle, fireworks, pageantry, larger-than-life personas, but Igor didn't play into any of it. No entrances, no emotion, just destruction. And yet, in his own way, he became one of Pride's most beloved stars. He wasn't just winning, he was finishing. And his opponents were often carried out. In an era where size mattered, Igor ignored it completely. He walked straight into fights with monsters like Gary Goodridge and Mark Kerr, often giving up 30 to 50 pounds. But it didn't matter. He made up for it with speed, precision, and a terrifying ability to absorb punishment. One of his most iconic fights came against the larger, stronger Enson Inoue. Enson battered Igor early, but Igor didn't flinch. He just kept walking forward, absorbing shots, and returning fire with surgical precision. By the third round, Enson was barely standing, and Igor was still walking him down. That became the blueprint. Weather the storm, then break them. He wasn't just a knockout artist. He was a machine. In 1999, Igor went on an undefeated streak that would baffle modern fans. He racked up dozens of wins with little rest between them. At one point, he reportedly fought 44 times over just a few years, finishing most of those bouts bouts by knockout. Pride's open-weight format made no difference to him. He fought whoever they put in front of him. Fighters knew when Igor was booked on the card, someone was probably going to the hospital. In Japan, they revered that. He was the perfect anti-hero, quiet, deadly, and unshakable. But something darker was building. The punishment he absorbed was inhuman. Pride wasn't regulated like the UFC. There were no post-fight suspensions, no real concussion protocol. Igor could take a head kick 1 week and be scheduled again the next. And because he never complained, never said no, he kept going. Over time, fans noticed the swelling, the facial damage, the scars that didn't fade. But Igor, he just fought harder. And that's what made it all the more haunting. He never said when it was too much. He never showed the pain. That silence would later become part of his myth and his undoing. As Igor Vovchanchyn's career progressed, so did the level of violence he absorbed. His early brawls may have built his legend, but it was the wars in Pride that pushed his body past the point of recovery. The turning point came during his now infamous fight with Kazuyuki Fujita in Pride Grand Prix 2000. It was supposed to be another step toward championship glory. Instead, it became one of the most brutal and one-sided beatdowns Igor ever suffered. He hit Fujita with everything: hooks, knees, uppercuts. Fujita refused to fall. Instead, the Japanese wrestler began mauling Igor with takedowns and elbows. For 15 agonizing minutes, Igor endured a relentless onslaught. He didn't tap, he didn't fall, but he was never the same again. That night changed him. Doctors later said he may have suffered a concussion, or several. He was hospitalized after the bout, and fans noticed something had shifted. He wasn't pulling the trigger like before. His footwork was slower. The once indestructible brawler now looked mortal, but Igor didn't stop, even with chronic injuries piling up. Hip damage, leg issues, facial trauma, he returned to fight against elite competition, time and time again. When Pride scheduled him against Mirko Krokop, fans feared the worst. Igor ate multiple head kicks and left the ring visibly shaken, but he never once complained. Not in interviews, not to his team, not to the press. The Pride schedule offered no mercy. Fighters often competed injured, underpaid, and without any guarantees of future safety. Igor was no exception. Despite the obvious damage, he never pulled out, and the promoters knew he wouldn't. That led to fights that, in hindsight, were near suicidal. His match against Heath Herring was a brutal wrestling-heavy affair that left Igor drained, but he fought on. His body was breaking, but no one stepped in. No trainer threw in the towel. No manager advised retirement. Igor had built a career on silence and stoicism, and now that same stoicism was leading him down a dark road. There were whispers from fellow fighters that Igor wasn't remembering sparring sessions, that he was having trouble processing instructions mid-fight, that his vision was going. But because he never showed emotion, because he never made excuses, no one truly knew how bad it was. And that's the tragedy. His legendary toughness made it impossible to tell when he was suffering. He was the quiet warrior, the one who walked into fire and never blinked. But even fire leaves scars, and Igor's body, once a fortress, was starting to collapse from the inside. Still, he kept walking forward, into whatever came next. In today's MMA world, fighters are surrounded by sports psychologists, dietitians, recovery experts, and medical teams tracking every bruise. In Igor's era, you iced your own injuries and hoped you could lift your arm by fight night. Vovchanchyn came from a generation where showing pain was weakness. Fighters didn't pull out with concussions, they just got knocked out again. In Pride, the spotlight shined on those who bled the most, and Igor bled plenty. His wars weren't clinical chess matches, they were collisions, and behind the scenes, the toll was stacking up. By the early 2000s, Igor had suffered numerous broken bones, nerve damage in his legs, and partial facial paralysis that made one side of his face sag slightly. Fans would comment on the subtle changes in his speech, but he never addressed it publicly. His camp didn't release statements. There were no press conferences, no "out due to injury" banners. He simply disappeared between fights and returned whenever the next card was booked. But insiders began noticing a pattern. Igor's training camps were getting shorter. shorter and his post-fight disappearances longer. Something was breaking down, and not just his body. In those years, Igor often fought in tournaments that required multiple fights in a single night. He once won a heavyweight Grand Prix by fighting and finishing 3 larger men in a single event. No matter how many injuries he had going in, he walked out with more. At one point, he told a friend that his legs felt like wood during training. His knuckles were so swollen that putting on gloves required soaking his hands in hot water. Yet not once did he complain. He just kept marching into the cage like a soldier heading to war. And the fans? They loved it. They chanted his name in broken accents, honored him with tribute posters, and called him the last real man in MMA. But beneath the adoration was exploitation. Igor wasn't on million-dollar contracts. Most of his pride earnings were modest by modern standards. When he fought, he got paid. When he didn't, the phone was silent. He didn't have a superstar agent or a sponsorship team handling his finances, and with his quiet demeanor, he never pushed for more. Promoters saw him as reliable, marketable violence, an easy call when they needed a war, a guaranteed knockout, a sacrificial brawler. And Igor accepted that role. Because, for him, fighting wasn't about fame. It was about something darker, a compulsion, a need. A cage was where he felt in control. But with every fight, that control was slipping away. Then, he was gone. No retirement speech, no tearful farewell, no cage-side announcement. One day, Igor Vovchanchyn just stopped fighting. He didn't post a goodbye. He didn't film a documentary. The Pride Ring, once his war zone, welcomed new stars, and Igor quietly stepped into the shadows. Most fans assumed he was injured. Others figured he'd return once healed. But months turned into years, and Igor, silent. No interviews, no social media, just a growing mystery. What made his disappearance so haunting was the total lack of closure. For someone who had given so much of himself physically, who had absorbed decades worth of trauma in half the time, he left without a trace. Those who reached out found nothing. Pride collapsed in 2007, engulfed in scandal and absorbed by the UFC. Many of its fighters transitioned, but not Igor. He never fought in the UFC, never joined commentary, never chased spotlight. It was as if the man who once terrified giants had simply vanished. Later, whispers emerged. Some claimed he was back in Ukraine, living a quiet life. Others said he was battling health issues from years of brain trauma and nerve damage. A few rare interviews in Russian surfaced in the 2010s. In one, he downplayed his disappearance, calling it just time to rest. But the tone said more than the words. He looked older, tired, and although he smiled, it didn't reach his eyes. There was no rage in him anymore. No fire, just fatigue. Friends close to him have shared that Igor suffered from chronic migraines and memory lapses. He often didn't recognize people from his fighting days. He rarely watched MMA anymore. It was too painful, not physically, but spiritually. Watching young fighters get cheered for flashy moves while forgetting the bloodbath that came before them, it stung. He wasn't bitter, but he was disillusioned. He'd given everything to a sport that gave him nothing back except broken bones and fading memories. Unlike other legends who stayed in the limelight, coaching, podcasting, promoting, Igor chose silence, and that silence became his legacy. Fans began mythologizing him, creating tribute videos, speculating on his whereabouts, but Igor didn't care. He never fought for applause. And now, far from the cameras, he seemed at peace, or as close to it as a man with his scars could be. Still, something about his vanishing felt unfair. The warrior who defined an era deserved a send-off, but he'd walked into war for years, and when the world stopped cheering, he walked out of it too. Ask hardcore MMA fans today who the greatest heavyweights are, and you'll hear names like Fedor Emelianenko, Cain Velasquez, or Stipe Miocic. But for a generation of fighters, the answer was Igor. Not because he was undefeated, not because he held a belt, but because no one walked through hell quite like he did. Igor Vovchanchyn was a pioneer of pain, a prototype of the iron-chinned striker. He didn't out-wrestle his opponents. He outlasted them. He didn't dance. He dragged you into a storm and waited to see who blinked first. And most of the time, it wasn't him. His legacy is preserved in grainy footage, bootleg VHS tapes, early YouTube uploads, forums filled with awestruck stories. Fighters today cite him as the reason they picked up gloves. Georges St-Pierre once called him one of the most terrifying punchers I've ever watched. Joe Rogan referred to him as the scariest short man in heavyweight history. And still, Igor shrank from it all. He didn't bask in his influence. He didn't capitalize on nostalgia. There was no Igor documentary, no branded supplements, just silent. Yet, the sport remembers. Every time a smaller fighter steps into the cage and throws with reckless abandon, Igor's ghost is there. Every time a brawler takes on a giant and wins, his legend echoes. But it's a legend built on pain, a warning wrapped in glory. Because for all his victories, Igor's career is also a lesson. That toughness without protection becomes tragedy. That silence in the face of suffering becomes erasure. He deserved more than bruises, more than scars. He deserved a thank you, but Igor never waited for it. To this day, fans send him messages. Most go unanswered. He doesn't show up to Hall of Fames or reunion shows. He lives in the background, quiet, unbothered. Maybe he found peace. Maybe he never will. But one thing's certain. Igor Vovchanchyn didn't just fight. He endured. And when the world moved on, he let it. Not with bitterness, not with regret, but with the same quiet strength that carried him through every war. A strength that didn't need applause, just space. And maybe, finally, rest. For years, the silence surrounding Igor Vovchanchyn wasn't just physical. It was cultural. His story had no arc, no proper ending, and for that reason, it was often ignored. The sport moved on, and as the UFC grew into a global empire, Igor's name slowly vanished from highlight reels and promotional packages. There were no anniversary tributes, no call-outs from modern fighters eager to challenge a legend. And yet, under the surface, hardcore fans kept his memory alive. They whispered about him like a ghost, this 5'8" barrel-chested knockout machine who walked through giants and left them sleeping in pools of sweat and blood. But the fallout of Igor's exit wasn't just the loss of a fighter. It was the loss of a mirror the sport didn't want to look into, because Igor's story forced a brutal question. What happens when a man gives everything? His body, his health, his youth, and the world forgets him. He was a test case for the price of being first. Pride was chaos back then. Fighter pay was inconsistent. Medical oversight was nearly non-existent. And the culture around toughness? It was poisonous. Fighters who pulled out were called cowards. Those who spoke up about pain were dismissed. And Igor? He never even tried. He knew his role, a silent executioner, and that silence became part of his brand. He rarely celebrated, never trash-talked. In press conferences, he gave clipped answers, his voice soft, his demeanor humble to the point of invisibility. This stoicism made him beloved by some, but overlooked by the mainstream. He wasn't marketable. He didn't sell t-shirts. And as the sport evolved into glitz and pageantry, there was no place for a man like Igor. That's why, when Pride collapsed and the UFC absorbed its talent, Dana White didn't make a push to bring Igor in. It wasn't about skill, it was about spectacle. And Igor wasn't spectacle. He was substance. Raw, dangerous, unsellable substance. There were rumors he could have returned. Bellator, Eastern European promotions, even a one-off retirement bout. But Igor declined all of it, quietly. No statements, no explanation. The same way he entered the ring, calm, unshaken, was the same way he left the sport. And yet, his absence spoke volume. Every now and then, he'd resurface in a grainy photo. Grayer, softer, but unmistakably him. The legend who never demanded to be seen. Long after his last fight, Igor Vovchanchyn's body continued to carry the cost of a career built on carnage. Privately, those close to him revealed he had trouble walking for long periods, likely due to years of unchecked nerve damage in his legs. His hands, once hammers that flattened giants, had grown stiff and arthritic. He no longer trained, no longer sparred. The man who once ate punches like breakfast could barely sleep without pain medication. His joints crackled, his hearing was spotty, and worst of all, his memory had started to fade. This wasn't unique to Igor. Many of his generation, fighters who came up in the Wild West of MMA, suffered similar fates. But few had endured the sheer volume of punishment Igor had, with over 60 professional fights, many of which were bare-knuckle or open-handed slugfests in unsanctioned events. His brain had been battered in in ways modern medicine is only beginning to understand. Chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE, hadn't even been discussed in combat sports back then. Fighters were told to shake it off and man up. But behind that outdated bravado were broken neurons, bleeding vessels, and ticking time bombs. Igor rarely complained about the pain. That wasn't his way. But his interviews became shorter, his public appearances more infrequent. In some moments, he appeared confused by basic questions, and fans noticed. The comments were kind, but sobering. He looks different. Hope he's okay. Damn, time hits hard. But it wasn't time. It was trauma. Years of sanctioned warfare packaged as entertainment. Years of being told to entertain at all costs, with no exit strategy, no pension, no safety net. What made Igor's situation more tragic was that he never sought sympathy. He could have come forward, could have warned others, but instead, he chose dignity. Even as his faculties declined, he held on to his pride. Not pride the promotion, but his inner pride, the kind that refuses to beg, that refuses to play the victim. And so, like a wounded lion, Igor receded from the world, not out of shame, but out of honor. Because for him, being forgotten was better than being pitied. Still, for the fans who loved him, the silence cut deep. They didn't want him in pain. They wanted him remembered. And the longer he stayed hidden, the more mythical and heartbreaking his story became. Igor Vovchanchyn's story is more than just a footnote in MMA history. It's a reckoning, a call to look back at the foundations of a sport now worth billions and ask, what did it cost? Because while today's fighters have managers, contracts, and health protections, Igor fought for peanuts and pride. He built the blueprint others now follow, and yet his name is rarely mentioned. He's not in the Hall of Fames, not on UFC montages, not even in the conversation when pundits list the all-time greats. And maybe that's because Igor never demanded to be remembered. But that doesn't mean he shouldn't be. His disappearance is a metaphor for every fighter who gave their body to the sport only to be cast aside when the show moved on. For every punch that fans cheered but never questioned. For every bloodied mouthpiece that was worth a viral clip but not a medical bill. Igor Vovchanchyn was a gladiator in an era that didn't care about its gladiator. And that should haunt us, because while fans chase knockouts and promotions chase profit, legends like Igor suffer in silence. Not because they failed, but because they were too early, too real, too human. In the end, Igor didn't vanish because he was ashamed. He vanished because he understood the cycle. Fighters rise, fans cheer, time passes, pain stays. He accepted that truth, but that doesn't mean we should. His life is a reminder that greatness shouldn't come with amnesia, that pain shouldn't mean invisibility, that those who build the house deserve more than just dust and silence when it's done. So next time you hear the roar of a crowd or see a highlight reel flash across the screen, remember the man who walked through fire and left without applause. Remember Igor, not for the pain he endured, but for the legend he became when no one was watching.